Well, you got to hear from our speaker just a little bit during the Ella Dickey Literacy Awards, but now to hear him speak more in depth about his most recent book, God and Churchill. His most recent book, his only book to date, but I just know there'll be more. Please welcome back to the stage, Jonathan Sands.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. Thank you very much indeed. I think I'll just say what I said before when I was here. Mark and Dixie, are you in here? Is Mark here? Dixie? No? Bertram? Okay. Mark! Could somebody just run out there and just shout and ask Mark to come here, please? Sorry. My wife is very heavily pregnant, as I explained, and so I have to keep my phone on. But there's little point in me having it on here because I won't hear it ring or anything like that. And so what I need is for Mark or Dixie to hold this phone, and then if it rings with Sarah, then anyway. Okay, I'm going to start on this, and then when they come in, I can deal with this from there. Oh yeah, Mark, can you take my phone? Sorry, hang on. If Sarah calls, please answer.
I'll give it to Dixie because
Okay.
I don't pay.
Okay, if Sarah answers. Right, excellent. Brilliant. Well, as I say, it is a real pleasure to be back here in Marshfield again and to be speaking to you again. I've spoken at Marshfield now 3 times. Last year I spoke about Churchill's leadership, and I didn't actually have the book formally there at this moment in time. It was still with the publishers and it hadn't yet been produced. However, this book, God and Churchill, has now finally come out, and I'm really thrilled at the response that has been received. And James was kind enough to actually endorse the book, along with several other people. But it was really James's endorsement that I found the most important, because I've always had a great respect for James and all that he has done and all that he has written. Indeed, he was a speechwriter in the White House and an incredible man as well. So, as I said before, if you get a chance to speak to James, do get a chance to speak to him. Can everybody hear me? Okay, can you hear me now? Is that better? Excellent, good. Okay, fine. Right, so, God and Churchill. I told you how it originated. Now I'm going to give you a bit of the evidence. I'm very pleased that so many of you have actually come back in for this, purely and simply because I wasn't sure after my last talk whether or not you'd actually come back and listen to me. But it reminds me of a story that my father told me about my great-grandfather when he went out to make a fairly boring political speech during the 1930s. And remember, in the 1930s, Winston Churchill was incredibly unpopular because he was the only man in Britain standing up warning about the rise of Adolf Hitler, which was incredibly unpopular at that time. And if you were a friend of Winston Churchill's, he was your only friend. You know, I mean, that's how serious it was. Anyway, Churchill was making this political speech, and this woman came up to him afterwards, noticing there was many people there, and she came up to him and said, "Mr. Churchill, you must be so pleased that so many people have come out to hear you speak this evening." And he looked at her and he smiled and he said, "Indeed I am, madam, but I cannot help thinking that if instead of making a political speech, I were being hanged, the crowd would be twice as big." I hope very much that's not going to be the case this afternoon, that you're not going to want to hang me at the end of this. But if you do, I'm sure you'll be able to find a length of rope somewhere around here and you string me up. Just make sure it looks good, okay? And keep my suit on. And I'd like the award around my neck when I get hanged as well. The purpose of God and Churchill was not to prove the existence of God. That is a question that is not going to be able to be formally answered until the very last day that this world exists. And on that day, I am confident that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to turn around and they're going to say, "What? You were right?" I believe that Winston Churchill will not be one of those who is caught surprised with the fact that God actually exists. And the evidence in God and Churchill proves it. On reviewing the evidence, my co-author Wallace Henley and I decided that there were 3 central points to writing God and Churchill. The first was to disprove the erroneous belief since 1965 that my great-grandfather was either an agnostic or an atheist. The second was to use the already well-researched and undisputed historical evidence surrounding great-grandpapa's life and times to prove that Churchill himself was right in his own professed belief that his life would not have been possible but for divine intervention. Having proven not only that Churchill had a faith in God, but indeed that the God my great-grandfather believed in did interfere in his life and protect and direct him, Wallace and I felt that this would offer hope to this world. I have to say, sometimes I do look out there. I live in Texas, and I look out there and I do sometimes feel quite hopeless. And you must feel the same way, particularly with the election cycle at this moment in time. I mean, after all, who are you actually going to vote for? You know, it's not really a choice, my great-grandfather once said. It's really just an alternative. And even it's not that. So, you know, some of you may feel it's very hopeless. However, the evidence in God and Churchill proves that Winston Churchill was indeed right, that God interfered in his life, and indeed worked at times during the Second World War. If that is true, and that is the case, then it is entirely possible that God is working in our individual lives today, and indeed in this world. So no matter what happens, whoever becomes president, it makes no difference. God has the control. God has his finger on the pulse. In order to effectively contradict the many well-respected historians who had written great-grandpapa off as an agnostic or an atheist, I felt that we first had to look at what Winston Churchill himself had to say. I am not a pillar of the church, but, as James Hume said, a flying buttress, he once remarked. Now, it is a common misconception that in order to be a person of faith, you either have to become dogmatic, or indeed you have to regularly attend some form of religious service. Interestingly enough, the Bible makes no reference to either. They shall be known by their fruits is how a person of faith is recognized. The Sermon on the Mount was, as my great-grandfather once described, the last word in ethics. And he went on to say that the more closely we follow the Sermon on the Mount, the more likely we are to succeed in our endeavours. Now, to recognise that the Sermon on the Mount was indeed the last word in ethics really is no great feat. I mean, it was obvious from start to finish that Jesus' words that day were on ethics. However, Jesus never said anything about following it and becoming a success because you follow it. So for Winston Churchill to take it that one step further, and to say that by following it more closely we're likely to succeed, would for the agnostic and the atheist, I think, be taking it that one step too far. However, if you consider that this apparent agnostic or atheist actually believed in the inherent power of Jesus' words, not just when Jesus spoke them, but indeed in his time and in our time, then maybe the words that great-grandpapa spoke that day made more sense. Great-grandpapa wrote, "We believe that the most scientific view, the most up-to-date and rationalistic conception will find its fullest satisfaction in taking the Bible story literally. We may be sure that all these things happened just as they are set out, according to Holy Writ." Churchill recognised what rational Christians have realised for years. Science exists not to be against religion, but indeed to explain concepts that we were either previously or are currently unable to explain. Clearly, by his own confession, great-grandpapa was a man of faith. Clearly, by his own confession, he believed in the literal words of the Bible. However, it has become fashionable since 1965 to say that Churchill only rolled God out in his speeches such as "Be ye men of valour," and saying upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization, purely as political rhetoric, purely to win support and votes. We see it in modern day politicians today, that in order to win support from all areas, they want to be able to roll God out. Some of them do have a faith, but some of them don't. Winston Churchill very definitely did. He had no need for such humdrum. The evidence in God and Churchill strongly supports my contention that Churchill had a very real faith in God. And if we want further evidence of this, we need to look at a confession written by his longtime bodyguard, Commander Walter Thompson, who was with him from the 1930s and indeed throughout the Second World War. Walter Thompson went round with my great-grandfather, and he felt that Churchill took what he considered too many unnecessary risks. Churchill was always seen out among the people. Hitler could have taken a pot shot any time he wanted, and on many occasions he did plan to do so, but clearly failed, which is good for me, and good for us all, actually. But the fact of the matter is, Churchill was not a person who believed in hiding away, and he argued with Walter Thompson on many occasions He would not go down into the bunker when the bombs were dropping on London. I have asked these people to risk everything. How can I possibly expect to do that, for them to do that, if I am not prepared to take the same risks myself? Churchill point blank refused. Now, out of interest, how many of you have been to Great Britain? Excellent. For the benefit of those who have not been to Great Britain, St James's Park is located very close to number 10 Downing Street. Number 10 Downing Street, as you know, is where the Prime Minister resides. Okay? Churchill liked to go walking late at night. And he liked to go walking in St James's Park. And any other decade, that would be fine. Any other time of year, absolutely fine. But to do it at the height of the London Blitz in 1940 is probably not the best time to actually choose to go for a walk. But Churchill liked his evening constitutional. He stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning, and this helped keep him going until 3 o'clock in the morning. And indeed, when he did finally get his head down on the pillow, comfortable or uncomfortable in that bunker though it was, he was resting because of that constitutional. On this one occasion that he and Walter Thompson were going walking in St James's Park, the sirens suddenly started to go off. Churchill immediately hot-footed it round the corner to number 10 with Thompson. As they rounded the corner, a massive explosion was heard. Quick as a flash, Great-grandpa ran back around the corner and stood there absolutely aghast. When Thompson caught up with him, he also stood there, his mouth completely dropped to the ground. Where Churchill had been standing not moments before was a large crater where this bomb had exploded. Now, Thompson hoped that this would teach my great-grandfather a lesson. However, Churchill understood it's called leadership, not fellowship. And so with eerie confidence, he looked at Walter Thompson and he smiled. And he said, "Don't worry, there is someone looking after me besides you." Thompson misunderstood. And he said to him, "I'm sorry, Prime Minister, do you mean Sergeant Davis?" Sergeant Davis was Walter Thompson's relief. Churchill smiled again and shook his head and he said no. And he pointed to the sky and he said, "I have a mission to perform, and that person intends to see it is performed." Our initial research almost immediately established that Winston Churchill had a faith in God, and indeed it was in a very real God, not a God that he would just roll out in public to win support, but a God that he would speak about in private as well. Churchill once wrote, "I realized with awful force that no exercise of my own feeble wit and strength could save me from my enemies, and that without the assistance of that high power, which interferes in the eternal sequence of causes and effects more often than we are always prone to admit, I could never succeed." We easily established that great-grandpa had a faith. We easily established that that faith was in a very real God. And this gave us the springboard to find the evidence to support our second contention, that Churchill himself was right, saying that divine intervention did interfere in his life and protect and direct him. In order to know this, or in order to see this, you need to know a fair amount about Winston Churchill's life. You could take one or two of the stories and, you could put them down to luck. I mentioned 3 stories in God and Churchill that convinced me there was more to the story than actually met the eye. Okay, for instance, the first story that I mentioned is Churchill's survival on the battlefield of Omdurman. When Churchill landed in India for the very first time a few years before Omdurman, he dislocated his shoulder. So badly was that shoulder dislocated, it kept popping out. So Churchill, being a cavalry officer, could not ride into the fray of battle holding his sword, which is what all cavalry officers did in those days. Churchill instead went in with a Mauser pistol. He was immediately set upon by 3 dervish soldiers, one who tried to hamstring his horse, the second who tried to pull Churchill from his horse, and the third who literally tried to kill Churchill. Quick as a flash, Churchill fired 3 shots, killing those 3 people. If he had had a sword, he would never have had the time to achieve this. Now, you could look at that story, you could say, well, that was just luck. Fine, write it off as luck. The second story that I mentioned, that I bring up in God and Churchill, is his escape from the Boers in South Africa in 1899. Churchill was a war correspondent. I don't have time to go into the details of the story itself, but it's actually quite an exciting story. Churchill was captured because he was trying to help the soldiers escape from this train that had been ambushed. He was trying to help the soldiers escape. And he went back to go and help them. He ended up being captured. However, being Winston Churchill, he was not going to be held captive for too long. And he was only held captive for about 2 weeks. He climbed into a latrine, and it took him a week and a half to get to Durban, where the British troops were. And on that journey, he had no water. Now, anyone could tell you that without water, you'll be dead in 3 days. Churchill had a choice when he got to a village. There were several houses, about 4 or 5 houses together. And he had to decide which house he was going to knock on the door for. There was a poster that Churchill was aware of that said Churchill wanted dead or alive for £25. Wanted dead or alive. So Churchill knew if he knocked on the wrong door, he'd either be returned to captivity or he'd be shot. So it was kind of a choice. Either I want to run the risk of being returned to captivity or shot, or I want to die of thirst and starvation. Churchill looked at the doors that were in front of him, and he decided the middle door was the door to go to. He didn't know why. He professed in his book, My Early Life, I didn't know why. But he decided that was the door to go and knock on. A man opened the window above and shouted out in Afrikaans, "What do you want?" Churchill, not speaking the language, looked up and replied in English and said, "I've just had a train accident. I've been thrown from a train. Please will you help me?" The man shut the window and came downstairs. He opened the door. He let Churchill in. As Churchill walked through to the living room, the man pulled a revolver on him. Churchill's heart sank to his feet. The man looked at him and in perfect English said to him, "I think you better tell me exactly what happened." Churchill looked at him and said, "My name is Winston Churchill and I have just escaped from a prison of war camp in Pretoria." That was it. Was he going to die or was he going to live? Was he going to get returned to captivity or not? No. The door that he had knocked on contained the only Englishman for 20 miles. The only door for 20 miles that he would not have been returned to captivity or shot. This man, at his own personal risk, hid Churchill down a coal mine for 3 days and eventually put him on a wool train to get him back to Durban and to get him back to safety. The only door for 20 miles. Once again, you can write that off. You can say, you know what, that was just luck. That and Omdurman, it was just luck. The third story that I mentioned in God and Churchill that drew me to the conclusion there was more to this story than met the eye comes from his experience in the trenches of France during the First World War. Now, hands up those of you who have heard of Gallipoli, or at least know a bit about the Gallipoli incident. I expect you to. Okay. For those of you who don't know, you need to look it up. Okay, Winston Churchill was, had made a serious miscalculation. Okay, but it wasn't actually all his fault. But he did actually make a serious miscalculation. As a result, being an honourable man, he resigned from the cabinet and he requested a posting to the French front in the trenches. Now, the trenches of World War I were terrible. I mean, really, really terrible. So much so, and so impacted was my great-grandfather by his experience in those trenches, that he made sure that when the Second World War came round, we did not fight trench warfare. It wasn't effective. And no way were we going to do it. It was impossible. Anyway, aircraft put paid to that anyway, so it wasn't going to be trench warfare. But the fact of the matter is, while Churchill was in the trenches in France, he was called off to go and see a general who wanted a meeting with him. It was cold. It was wet. Churchill did not want to leave his billet in this trench. He was cold. It was wet, but at least, he was covered over. But he really didn't want to trek, 2 hours in one direction to then get taken to this general by car, and go and meet this general. But it was his commanding officer. He had to do it. So reluctantly, he climbs out of the trench and he walks off. He waits for 3 hours for the driver to suddenly turn up to say, "I'm terribly sorry, we broke down." And it doesn't matter anyway because the general said, it's not an important meeting, so he's cancelled it anyway. Churchill was furious. He stormed back to the trench. I mean stormed back, furious that his time had been wasted, that he really didn't want to have to do this. He was cold, he was wet, he was annoyed. That all changed immediately he saw the trench. His billet no longer existed. 15 minutes after Churchill had left that trench, a bomb had dropped on the billet. It had killed the man who was in there. It would have killed Winston Churchill if he indeed had been in there. Now, once again, you can write that story off and you say, that was just luck. Churchill was a very lucky man. But when I can add 20 or 30 other situations that Churchill couldn't possibly have either survived or indeed have got himself into or indeed been able to actually do something about it, luck runs out. Now I challenge you, and I'm very happy today to not only give you this award, I will scratch out my name on the book, I will call you a great-grandchild of Churchill, I will do whatever you want, okay? If there is anyone who can answer yes to this next question, and you can have anything you want, is there anyone in this room who will honestly state that their life to date has been based solely on luck? Anyone at all? If we can't claim it, then Churchill couldn't claim it. So at some stage you have to recognise there had to be something else involved. If not God, then what? What was intervening in Churchill's life? The earliest instance we see of this divine intervention in Churchill's life comes in the year 1891, when my great-grandfather was but 16 years old and a schoolboy at Harrow. He and a friend of his, Merlin de Grasse Evans, were talking about their futures. And great-grandpa suddenly chirped up, "London will be attacked. I shall be in command of the defences of London, and it will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire." Churchill predicted in that moment 3 impossible to foresee situations, and taking them step by step. The first, London will be attacked. For those of you who know your geography, you know that London is very protected by the home counties. If you want to attack London, the easiest way, in fact the only way of attacking London, is via air. Because if you try to land on the coastline, every man jack of them will be waiting for you. And I assure you that this time, we won't be wearing red coats. We've learnt our lesson. Every man jack of them will fight you. You will lose the majority, if not all of your troops, before you get to London. So the only way you can actually reach London, practically, is via the air. And in 1891, aircraft hadn't been formally invented. Now, interestingly enough, in my research, I came across a physicist called Samuel Langley, who was living here in America, and he was working on the experimentation of aircraft. And his aerodrome aircraft had managed to fly for 1/4 of a mile before it ditched. But the American press had no interest in reporting this fact. So it is highly unlikely that great-grandpa had ever heard of Samuel Langley, or indeed had ever heard that flight was trying to be invented at that moment in time. However, as God and Churchill is based on fact and not on supposition, and I am unable to prove that my great-grandfather had never heard of Samuel Langley, or indeed had not read some obscure article in some obscure publication about Samuel Langley or about aircraft invention, I felt this was one we needed to give to the agnostics and the atheists. This was one that we needed to discard and say, okay, we can't prove this part of the evidence. So we moved on to the second part. I shall be in command of the defences of London. There are 2 points here. Firstly, in order to be in command of the defences of London, there are only 2 positions in Britain that give you that command. The first is Prime Minister, and the second is Minister of Defence. In 1891, the Ministry of Defence didn't exist. It didn't actually exist until Winston Churchill proposed it in the middle of the 1930s, and it was the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin who took up the idea and created what became the Ministry of Defence. However, and I'm going to slightly digress here, interestingly enough, history has blamed Neville Chamberlain for leaving Britain completely unprepared for the Second World War. History has neglected to actually record the truth. And the truth is that Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was responsible for leaving Britain unprepared. He, in fact, was responsible for the fact that Hitler was able to rise. He had in his hands the black and white facts from the British Foreign Office, proving that Germany was rearming, proving how Germany was rearming, and proving how quickly Germany was rearming. But he chose to ignore those facts. He wasn't interested in upsetting Mr. Hitler, because he didn't want a Second World War. So he felt that burying his head in the sand would solve that problem. Churchill was talking Churchill was talking about one day becoming Prime Minister. And Merland, in his letter to his son Randolph, recalling this story, said, your father did not know what he wanted to do, whether he was going to go into the army or whether he was going to go into politics. But clearly Churchill is talking here about becoming Prime Minister. Churchill is not just talking about becoming Prime Minister, he's talking about becoming Prime Minister at a time when London is attacked. He is very specific. London will be attacked. I shall be in command of the defences of London. So when London is attacked, when we are at war, I will be Prime Minister, is what he is saying. If you look at Churchill's popularity throughout the 1920s and throughout the 1930s particularly, you see that Winston Churchill was the most unpopular person in Britain. He wasn't just the most unpopular politician, he was the most unpopular person in Britain. If you were a friend of Winston Churchill, you had one friend. That was it. I am blessed to have over 4,000 people who have friend requested me on Facebook, of which I know maybe 150. I'm not, I really love the fact that people are friend requesting me, and please, if you have not already, then please continue to do so. I welcome it. But the fact of the matter is, I only know 150. And I use this point to illustrate this. If I were a friend of Winston Churchill's in the 1930s, that friend list would diminish to one. Nobody wanted to know Winston Churchill. I would give anything to be Doctor Who and go back in a time machine. I mean, seriously, I've got the British accent. Okay, and that would be good to go back in time. Because knowing what I know now, I would be a friend of Winston Churchill's. I probably wouldn't tell him I was his great-grandson. But, I would definitely be a friend of Winston Churchill's. Because that would be a great idea to do that. So, Churchill was the last person that we would call upon, not just in a crisis, but indeed he was the last person that we would call upon even at a time of peace. Because nobody wanted to know him. So it was highly unlikely that he would ever actually become Prime Minister. So I moved on to the third part of what he had predicted. It will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire. Now, over the years, many, many things have been attached to Winston Churchill to describe him. Self-centered, arrogant, bumptious, a warmonger, treacherous, evil. Somebody even claimed that he manipulated America to get involved in the war. All of these wonderful accolades have been attached to my great-grandfather's name. But until God and Churchill, there was one title, one word that was missing. Humble. It's not a word you tend to associate with Winston Churchill. But actually, Winston Churchill was an incredibly humble man. And he proved it on several occasions, not least of which was at the end of the Second World War, when every single Allied country was falling over themselves to give my great-grandfather an honour. Everybody wanted to honour Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill refused every single honour. He claimed it was the nations around the globe that had the lion's heart. I was merely privileged enough to be called upon to be its roar, and to sometimes direct the lion on where it could use its claws. Up to the day of Churchill's death, he denied that he had done anything towards the war. I've been a public speaker now since 2005, and for those of you who aren't good at mathematics, which I'm not, that's 11 years. And for 11 years I've gone around this wonderful country talking about my great-grandfather. And so many people have come up to me in that time, and they have said, but for your great-grandfather we'd be communists, but for your great-grandfather we'd be Nazis, but for your great-grandfather we wouldn't have our freedom, but for your great-grandfather we would have lost the Second World War. It is the accolade the world has given my great-grandfather, that because of him, It fell to him to save the capital and to save the empire. As I said, it is not an accolade my great-grandfather would accept. So, Churchill said, London will be attacked. I shall be in command of the defences of London, and it will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire. Now, in the religious world, this is where we separate prediction from prophecy. This is the ballpark, okay? This is where we separate it. A prediction is widely accepted. A prediction can come from anybody, and it doesn't necessarily have to come true as it's been spoken. But in order for something to be a prophecy can only come from God. In order for it to qualify as a prophecy, it has to come true exactly as the prophet has spoken. In this case, Winston Churchill. So let's analyze this. Churchill said, London will be attacked. Now I'm going to ask you 3 redundant questions. And I would like you to really answer them, with some Marshfield energy. It's the first day of the Cherry Blossom Festival. If you can't answer them with energy today, you're not going to be able to answer things with energy at the end of the Cherry Blossom Festival. So let's have some real energy in this room. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to say, God save the Queen. First of all, was London attacked?
Yes.
London was attacked officially in the September of 1940. Winston Churchill was made Prime Minister in the May of 1940. So, at a time when London was attacked, was Winston Churchill Prime Minister and in command of the defences of London?
Yes.
Did we win the war?
Yes.
Mary? We did. Otherwise the Red Army would be coming back in and they would, be grabbing me and taking me away. Everything that Churchill said was true. London was attacked. He was indeed in command of the defences of London. And by the accolade of the world, it fell to Winston Churchill to save the capital, to save the empire. The only thing he got wrong, he left out of that, was the world, was freedom. But it's the accolade that we have given him. Now, further evidence of this comes if you consider what would have happened if Winston Churchill had actually been a popular politician. If he had wanted to be a popular politician. Let's just analyse that for a moment. He would have most definitely have been part of the Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin coalition government during the 1930s when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. And he would have been so thrilled that Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany and this wonderful forward-thinking man, yes, he shouts a bit, but hey, forward-thinking man has taken over Germany and that's great. He would most definitely have been a great supporter of Stanley Baldwin's. And when he discovers that Stanley Baldwin was ignoring the black and white evidence that Hitler was rearming, he most certainly would have happily ignored that fact because he wanted to be a popular politician. So he too would have been blamed for that. When Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937, after Stanley Baldwin resigned as Prime Minister or retired as Prime Minister, Churchill would have been an avid supporter of appeasement. Sadly, on September the 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, Churchill, with the rest of the world, would have woken up to find that his wonderful name and this reputation that he had wanted to build of being a popular politician would have been tarred by those 2 terrible words in history: too late. Wallace and I maintain that it was very much divine intervention that kept my great-grandfather at the back of politics throughout that time. Churchill in 1919 was the greatest advocate against the Treaty of Versailles. He looked at the financial reparations we were demanding of Germany and he said, those are malignant. In the early part of the 1930s, he saw the danger that if we continued to bankrupt Germany in the way that we were doing, we would eventually see another war. But he was ignored. In 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he saw again, Hitler is a danger. These Nazis are a danger. They are looking for weapons. But once again, the government ignored him. Finally, when Chamberlain in 1935, when Baldwin ignored those black and white facts, a brave man called Ralph Wigram from the British Foreign Office gave Churchill these documents, proving that Hitler was rearming. And Churchill in 1936 managed to get Stanley Baldwin and the government on the run, promising to rearm Britain. And they did, but at a very, very slow rate. Because guess what? They didn't want to upset Mr. Hitler. When Chamberlain became Prime Minister, Churchill was against appeasement. In 1938, you remember that when Chamberlain came back with that piece of toilet paper that had Hitler's signature on it. Peace in our time, he declared. Churchill said, we have sustained a defeat without a war. When Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, he was in fact the only person in Great Britain who was equipped and ready to take control. He indeed was the only person in Britain who honestly believed that Hitler could be defeated and the Nazis could be defeated. If he had been able to be blamed for anything that had happened from 1919 all the way up to 1939, this world, my country, your President Roosevelt, would never ever have listened to him, because they would have seen he switched sides. He was what you call in America, I believe, a flip-flop. He would have changed sides. Divine intervention ensured that Churchill came at the background. So, when I was writing God and Churchill with Wallace, the three questions we asked were, firstly, was Churchill a man of faith, and was that faith in a real God? The evidence in God and Churchill most definitely supports that fact. Secondly, did the God that Churchill believed in really, honestly and truly intervene in his life and protect and direct him? Once again, the evidence in God and Churchill strongly supports us. This being the fact, it should offer us great hope today. Because as I said at the start, the evidence stands for itself. If you don't believe the evidence in God and Churchill, then I ask you to take Martin Gilbert's book, Churchill A Life, and to read the life story of Winston Churchill. That is the one volume of the 8 volumes combined. Over 8,000 pages have been written on my great-grandfather in his biography. And this is just 1,066 pages. Yes, 1066. And I did ask Martin if that was deliberate. And he said, no, actually it was quite by chance. So anyway, but the fact of the matter is, once you have read Martin Gilbert's book, you should be convinced. Because you'll see all the instances that I saw myself where Churchill could not possibly have survived. Now, this is the interesting thing. Winston Churchill was nothing special. We hold him up as a hero, and indeed he was a great hero, but no less a hero than the men and women of this country and indeed this world who have fought for their countries and for freedom. And at this moment in time, I would actually like, if anyone here has served their country, or indeed is serving their country at this moment in time in the military, or in any of the armed services at all, will you please just rise and be recognised right now? Anyone at all? Ready? Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. My great-grandfather described you as the backbone of our countries. So thank you for your service. The next group of people I would like to recognise are any members of the emergency services, whether it be the fire brigade, whether it be the ambulance service, or whether you're a doctor or a nurse, or whether indeed you're a police officer. Is there anyone here who represents any of those? No? Okay, well, you know, that's another group. Yes, this lady here. Thank you very much. And the final group of people that I would like to recognise, for which we owe a great debt. We wouldn't be here without these people. I wouldn't be here without these people. Our teachers, educators, those who work in education. If you are working in education, or you've worked in education, or you are currently a teacher, or something to do with teaching, will you please stand up? And that includes homeschoolers as well. Please stand up. Thank you. Thank you very much for your service to humanity. Without you, we don't have the veteran. Without you, we don't have the emergency services. I don't know about you, but I'd hate to have my brain worked on by somebody who didn't have some form of qualification. And I'd rather it wasn't something from the sort of junk joke, university that I can buy a degree online from for $25. I'd rather it was somebody who actually went to university and actually studied brain surgery. So thank you to those teachers. Winston Churchill was nothing special. Winston Churchill was a man who was prepared to humble himself before God and indeed humble himself before man. He wanted to truly serve. Imagine what this world would be like today if our politicians, if our leaders wanted to genuinely serve us. Gosh, do you think we'd be at war with anyone? Do you think we'd all be broke? Do you think taxes would be so high? I don't think so. Wow, if we could roll time back to the times of those politicians in my great-grandfather's time, those who wanted to genuinely serve the people, I believe that this world would look very different than it does today. Winston Churchill led with courage, with faith and with integrity. And last year I talked to you about my second book on Churchill's leadership, which is going to be called Lead Like Churchill, Courage, Faith and Integrity. And I'm hoping it's going to come out next year, but it's in the stages at the moment that we're about to send it to the publishers. But we needed to write God and Churchill first, because we needed to prove that Churchill had a faith. The reason it's called Lead Like Churchill, Courage, Faith, Integrity is because the faith needed to be in the middle, because it supports and balances the courage and integrity. Without the faith, you've got nothing. Without the faith, you can't explain Churchill's leadership. You can't explain how a man stepped forward believing that this man who outnumbered us 5-1 could actually be defeated. You can't explain how he survived so many times. You can't explain how he was maneuvered into positions. You can't explain how his life was possible. On this one occasion in recent history, God did us a favor. God left us breadcrumbs to follow. It's up to us to decide whether it's true or not. It's up to you as the reader. I have merely presented you with a bit of the evidence. There is a lot more in God and Churchill. And it has indeed been a great honour to present that to you. As my great-grandfather once said, when you are ready, you throw the book out to the public. And I'm honoured to hear comments from those that have read my book, because I really would like to know what you genuinely think. I had an argument with an atheist the other day who refused to read my book because he was an atheist. And I said, well, read the book and tell me what you think. But he was the one who also said that Winston Churchill manipulated America into joining the war. How that worked, I'm not quite sure. He was convinced that Hitler was never going to come over to America. But anyway, that is. But ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to present you with God and Churchill, and I will happily sign copies for anyone who wants to actually do it. The books are going to be sold at $25 each. However, if you buy 2 or more, they'll be $20 each. And part of the proceeds will go back to the Cherry Blossom Festival, because I really want to support the Cherry Blossom Festival. Now, I do believe that I have a few minutes to answer questions. Are there any questions? This is always the frightening time. Yes, now. Excellent. Thank you. Somebody actually step forward.
I'm very fond of a quote from Churchill that I picked up years ago, and I haven't called the Churchill Museum yet to ask if it's real.
Okay.
And the one we have in Fulton, I presume you've been
Yeah.
there.
Yes, it is.
Good.
I have.
And I hope they sell your books there.
Yeah, I'm hoping so too. I think so, yes. I've not been there for a while, but yes.
You know, where he gave the Iron Curtain.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Anyway, the quote I remember, and I thought it was very apt because I myself went to Russia and some other parts of the Soviet Union in 1967. And I think that was the year I heard it. It had to do with when he was in Moscow and there were people lined up in the streets waiting to get their ice cream in the dead of winter.
Okay.
And he said, these people will never be defeated. Later, of course, I presume it's later, that's part of what I want to know, that is exactly what happened in Stalingrad, where hand-to-hand combat stopped Hitler's troops, and basically it was retreat from there by Hitler. So it was important, I think, to make that connection.
I don't know whether the quote is correct or not, but I will have to look into it. James, do you know whether that quote is correct? Okay, I'll talk to you afterwards.
My point is that he was talking about the people of the world, including the Russians who were our allies, at that moment.
I say, I can't confirm the quote. I would need to look it up and check. I apologize, I don't know all the quotes.
I mean, in your quote, when you were talking about how he gave credit to the people
Yes.
The one that the people, that everyone in the world knew, turned back Hitler, were the Russians and Bolshevik, Stalingrad, same thing.
Well, yes, I mean, the Russians did sort of fight Hitler back, and we were very grateful for what they did.
Right.
So, yeah.
So the thing about the Red Army would have run over us as members. In any case, the other thing I want to say is very important is that he was joined in his point about the Treaty of Versailles by many people, including a group of women.
Yeah, indeed. I'm not saying that he wasn't joined with it. I'm just saying that he stood up against it.
Yes, I'm just saying that one of those women won the Nobel Peace Prize,
Excellent. Yeah.
namely Jane Addams.
Okay.
And that she had organized a whole meeting at that time as a sort of anti-Treaty of Versailles
Sure.
meeting. And that her organization is still running, which is the Women's International League.
Okay.
for Peace and Freedom.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Excellent. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just a comment. I
Yes.
just finished the book. It's better to reread it.
You liked it. You want to reread it. That's
Just
great.
in a textbook.
Thank you. Yes, that would be very nice. But when you ban school prayer, I don't think you can make a textbook that is called God at Churchill. However, it would be very nice if they actually did it. And yes, we are planning on putting it in as a textbook. Actually, the homeschool community wants to pick it up. So, they're definitely going to pick it up. But if we get it into mainstream schools, that would be great. Thank you for your support. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did you bring up, you may have already said it, but did he mention anything about the fact that Germany would have beat us if the Japanese had not invaded us, we had split them up?
Churchill always credited America with helping us win the war. He always said that we couldn't have done this without America. At the end of the war in 1945, he actually looked at his private secretary and said, once I had started this thing, I couldn't stop. And then without the Americans, I could never have won it. He recognized the fact that America played a pivotal role in ensuring that we actually won the war. And you really did. You're an amazing, amazing people. I'm so proud to live in America and to actually be married to an American. It is incredible how far you guys have, how much you've achieved in less than 300 years. You've achieved much more than the British and the Roman empires combined in less than 300 years. You should be very proud of being Americans, because you really are a great nation of people.